Keycards are a serious problem on the Nintendo Switch 2, and the big thing is, nobody likes them. Now initially this was not a video that I had in mind making, but I was working on a separate video where keycards were actually a topic of conversation in that video, and I realized I have a lot that I actually want to say in regard to the keycard situation on the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, for those of you who are unaware, because I did recently get a comment asking what a keycard was, keycards are new Nintendo Switch cartridges that have none of the game actually on the cartridge. When you insert the cartridge into the Nintendo Switch 2, it prompts a download and you have to fully download that particular game. There is literally nothing on that cartridge, and it kind of just feels bad. That's the best way to describe the entire situation. It just feels bad. So we're going to talk about the keycards in depth here. Let me know in the comments below as we go through if you agree or disagree with any of my takes along the way here, but let's get into it. So with the keycard situation at hand, many people are asking, who are these even for? And ultimately, I feel like in the scheme of things, as far as the people making keycards, they're for people like myself. I don't know if you guys can see, I have a lot of physical Switch games. It's for the physical collectors. In theory, anyway. In theory, it's for us, the physical collectors. The problem is, as a physical collector, I don't want to have anything on my shelf that doesn't actually have the game on the cartridge. It feels bad. Why does it actually feel bad? Because of the thought that it's just empty. It's not like something like my copy of Mario Odyssey, where I just slot in Mario Odyssey and can play the game without any internet connection or anything like that. The game is on that cartridge. I don't ever have to worry about it. A game keycard is an empty piece of plastic that if I do not have internet connection, I cannot access because I have to download the game first. Now, I will say, after you download the game, all you need is the keycard in the system in order to actually play the game, but it still feels incredibly bad knowing that the card doesn't actually have the game on it. So while in theory, I understand you want to put games on the shelf because Nintendo fans are very much physical buyers. Most of the sales for the Nintendo Switch 2 software were physical games at launch. So I understand wanting to have your games on the shelf, but this doesn't seem to be the solution. And this is proven true in an article on GameSpot here. Nintendo Switch third-party developer claims that sales were below our lowest estimates. One third-party Nintendo Switch game developer told the game business that sales numbers were below the lowest estimates, highlighting the lukewarm performance of third-party launch titles in the first 2 weeks of the Switch 2's lifespan. So this means games like Bravely Default, Hitman, all of those game keycards were performing below average on the system. And while there is an argument to be made that this is partly because a lot of those games had already released on other platforms, people had already had access to those games, there is still that data available. People that are putting these games out, looking at CD Projekt Red, looking at Hitman developers, looking at all those companies that put these games out, they already have that information at their disposal. They know these games are remakes, remasters, ports, whatever they may be. They know that those games are likely going to perform worse simply because of that fact. They know that people already have access to them. For example, I myself, I have Cyberpunk on PlayStation as well as on Xbox. They know that I'm not the most likely candidate to pick up Cyberpunk on the Switch. So they have all of that data and information. So they put that into the data and the statistics that they're putting together in order to get their high and low end of the spectrum on what their projected sales are going to be. And do I think that this drop in below expectations is due to the keycard situation? I think a lot of it is in fact due to the keycard situation. I don't think that many people out there are actually buying the game keycards. However, it is worth noting that third-party unit share of Switch 2 physical software during week 1 reached just shy of 40%, which is double what third-party games did at the launch of Switch 1. So in the Switch 1's life cycle at launch, only 20% of the games that were bought for the Switch 1 were actually third-party games. However, it is double on the Switch 2. There are more third-party games that are supported on the Switch 2. Many developers wanted to get in on the Switch 2 simply because the Switch was such a success. So more developers were more interested in coming and putting their games onto Switch 2 sooner than later, looking at games like Cyberpunk, looking at things like Hitman, looking at all of those games that are coming, including things down the road like Elden Ring and Final Fantasy VII Remake. All of those games are getting moved to the Switch 2 sooner than what we got a lot of third-party ports on the Switch 1. And that's because the Switch was such a success. So we're seeing these games come over. So with there being more games, that also means it's more likely that they would have higher percentage sales for the Switch 2 versus the Switch 1, because there's just more games being put out on the system. So while yes, it is worth noting that it is performing better than the Switch 1 did with third-party titles, it's still lower than they estimated, and I think a lot of that has to do with the keycard situation. However, there are games out there that are entirely on the cartridge. Looking at third-party games like Cyberpunk 2077, this is fully on the cartridge. This is the full Cyberpunk game as well as the DLC Phantom Liberty for Cyberpunk. This game is entirely playable on the cartridge with no additional downloads, and that's very interesting considering the fact that reports are saying Cyberpunk was the best-selling third-party Switch 2 game at launch. So in this article from comicbook.com, it says Nintendo Switch 2 has been available for 2 weeks now, and the system itself seems to be performing quite well. Most regions are reporting big sales numbers, but it seems early adopters have largely rejected the third-party games that launch alongside it. According to a report from the game business, sales for the system's third-party launch games have been mostly low, with one publisher stating the game came below their lowest estimates, like we talked about earlier. However, it wasn't all bad news, as one game seemed to rise above the rest. That was CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077. Cyberpunk 2077 is officially the best-selling third-party game on the Nintendo Switch 2 right now, with sales currently outpacing The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt on the original Switch. So it is interesting to me that the game that has the entire game on the cartridge is the best-selling third-party game on the Switch system. Now, there are some other games out there like Rune Factory, Guardians of Azuma, that is fully on the cartridge as well. So there are a handful of third-party developers that are putting their entire game on the cartridge, and that is something that you need to be aware of. Definitely be sure you're checking the boxes of the games, because it is listed right there so you guys know that it is a key card. Now we can finally get into who's at fault here and why this whole situation is bad. First, the argument that I keep seeing online that I just disagree with entirely is that this is all Nintendo's fault, because Nintendo is not the first company to do things like this. If you look at the history of PlayStation 4, Xbox One, going into PS5 and going into the Xbox Series consoles, this is not a new practice. There are games on those systems that require additional downloads because there is minimal amount of data on the actual disc that you receive for a physical copy. These are games like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, looking at games like Call of Duty. These games have very limited amount of data on the actual disc because of the fact that these are very large games and maybe the disc just didn't support the size. They don't have a size of a disc that supports these games, or it's cheaper to go with a smaller disc size and then have you download the game later. And this is an argument that we see for the Nintendo Switch 2. There is a leak out there, and there's no official confirmation of this yet, that there are only game key cards or a 64GB cartridge for the Nintendo Switch 2. And because of the speed that you get on these new cartridges that are being used by the Switch 2, if there is only a 64GB cartridge, that means that it's very expensive to actually purchase the cartridge to run the game, especially with there being only a 64GB cartridge. A lot of the games that are on the system don't even get to half a 64GB cartridge as far as storage space requirements, meaning that they're putting it on a larger cartridge with no real reason to. And this cuts into sales profits for these companies, which leads to them deciding to opt out of buying the physical cartridge for these games and putting them on a key card, because it's going to increase their profit margins in the long run. So ultimately, it seems like companies are doing this exclusively to save money, with the exception of CD Projekt Red and the Guardians of Azuma developers that we've already talked about, because looking at Cyberpunk 2077, it's a massive game, and it likely fit just comfortably on the 64GB cartridge. It probably could have gone bigger, but they were managed to compress everything down to get everything onto that cartridge, which is pretty impressive on their part. But like I said, that game probably is very close to the 64GB requirement on that cartridge. So for them, it felt like a win to put it on the cartridge and get that goodwill with consumers by having the entire game on the cartridge. But why is all of this actually bad? Well, like I said earlier, none of the game is actually on the cartridge. And the big concern is that later down the road, in a world where the Nintendo eShop shuts down, or wherever we're downloading these games from, if they're on separate servers, whatever have you, that eventually those shut down, and then you just have a piece of plastic that can no longer download the game that you purchased. And I can agree with this to an extent. This would be a worst case scenario. This actually would suck if this were to come to fruition. The one thing I will say as a counterpoint to this is that Nintendo has a long history of supporting their games long after they actually close down certain storefronts for purchases. Looking specifically at the Wii is still able to connect to the storefront and re-download purchases that you've already made. You just cannot add a credit card and purchase new titles. You can still download everything you already bought, just not get new stuff. So with a system as old as the Wii, it kind of gives you a sense of comfort knowing that that storefront is still up and you're still able to download those games with no issues right now. It kind of makes the idea that the eShop, the Nintendo Switch eShop, is going to shut down. It kind of makes that idea feel very fantasy-like, something that's not necessarily within anyone's lifetime. Like, I'm not at all worried about seeing the eShop shut down, and by the time the eShop does shut down, I've got a feeling I'm going to be too old to care. So that's just my stance on that particular argument. But again, I will say, as a physical collector, I don't like seeing the game not on the cartridge. If I have something on my shelf, I want to actually have the game there. I want it to be there, not an empty piece of plastic that I really don't need. So ultimately, what is the solution to the keycard situation? Well, ultimately what it comes down to is do not buy game keycards. Now, I want to preface when I say don't buy game keycards, that doesn't mean don't buy these games. It does not mean don't buy these games. The thing about this is that if we don't support the third-party developers that are putting these games onto the Nintendo Switch, then we aren't going to see continued support from third-party developers. So if they're not seeing the sales, then they're not going to keep spending the money to put the games on the system, which is kind of backwards as to what we want, because obviously we want the games on the system, we just want them fully on the system. So the strategy that I personally have adopted is one that I've talked about since they announced game keycards, and that's that if a game is a game keycard, I'm just gonna buy the game digitally. And the reason I say that is because, like I've said throughout this entire video, if I have an empty cartridge on a shelf, I don't want it. I don't need to take up the extra room on my shelf where I already have a bunch of other physical games. I don't need to take up that space if the game is not actually on the cartridge. So I'm just going to go about buying those games digitally that I want to play. A perfect example of this is Wild Hearts S that's coming to the Nintendo Switch on July 25th. I'm a big Monster Hunter fan. I think this game looks pretty cool, and I'm keen to see how it runs on the Nintendo Switch too. So, knowing that that game is a keycard, I've already prepped to buy the game on the Nintendo eShop, so that way I can still play the game and review the game and feature it here on the channel, but I'm not supporting the practice of the game keycards. And that is kind of the strategy that I've adopted. Now, the other alternative is finding alternate solutions to the keycard situation. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of games currently that are coming out that are still on the previous system. First and foremost, let's talk about Civilization 7. This game came to the Nintendo Switch 2. However, the Switch 2 physical version is not even a keycard. It's a code in a box. So because I wanted the physical cartridge with the game on I bought the Switch 1 version of this game. I bought the Switch 1 version and I bought the upgrade on the eShop, so that way I had a Civilization 7 cartridge for the Nintendo Switch. That means that I have this game and I can play it even if the eShop goes down. I have this game on the cartridge. And another perfect example of this is Shadow Labyrinth that's coming out later this month on July 18th. Shadow Labyrinth is coming to Nintendo Switch as well as Nintendo Switch 2. Now, the Switch 2 version of Shadow Labyrinth is a game keycard. However, the Switch version of this game is fully on the cartridge. And what is worth noting is that with Shadow Labyrinth, there is a free upgrade to the Switch 2 version on the eShop. So if you have the Switch 1 version, you can automatically upgrade that at no additional charge to the Switch 2 version for this particular game. So for me personally, I pre-ordered the physical version on my Nintendo Switch. So I'm going to have a Switch 1 version of Shadow Labyrinth show up at my doorstep, and I will upgrade that for free to the Nintendo Switch 2 version. So this is just an alternate solution, is finding games that have a Switch 1 version that has the game on the cartridge and then upgrading them to the Switch 2 version so you don't have to support the keycard practice. The other thing that you really should do is look at those games that are available, like Cyberpunk, that are fully on the cartridge, and support those games. If a game is fully on the cartridge and you're even slightly interested in that game, buy the game. Like I said, I own Cyberpunk on other platforms. However, I really wanted to play Cyberpunk mainly because I make content on the Switch 2, and I don't like game keycards, so I bought this game to show support to the developers who put this entire game on the cartridge. And this goes for other games like Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma. If you're interested in that game, buy it physically, especially if you're someone like myself who does on occasion buy games digitally as well as physically because of sales, what have you. If you don't like game keycards, buy the game physically. Even if there's a better sale on the eShop, I would recommend buying this physically because that shows support to the games that are entirely on the cartridge. Ultimately, the only way that we can get around game keycards and get them to eventually phase out of the market is to speak with our wallets. We have to not buy them. But again, we don't want to not buy the third-party games that are on the system because we still want those games to come over. We want to see future games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or, you know, other games like The Witcher 3 get an upgrade to the Switch 2 version. We want to see stuff like that come to the system, but we don't want to see them on keycards. So the best way to do that is to not support the keycard practice, but still support the developers that are bringing those games over, whether it be buying the physical games that are entirely on the cartridge like we talked about, or buying the games digitally. That's just the ultimate way to go about saying that we just don't like game keycards. So that is my thoughts on game key cards. I don't like them. I'm not supporting them. I do not own any. And like in the past, I've been burnt by this too. I understand completely if you bought a game in the past that you had to download and you were unaware of it. I have Overwatch. I didn't realize this was a code in a box when I bought Overwatch on the Switch. Other games that are examples of this, Hogwarts Legacy on the original Switch. This one is technically a game key card because you have to download, right there it says you have to download the whole game. Another one, The Outer Worlds. You have to download the whole game in order to play it. So technically keycards have existed for a while, but they've just made a bigger deal about it. So it happens. Sometimes you get burnt. I will say with the new keycards, they do make it very apparent that you're buying a keycard. So you can avoid these so much easier than we used to be able to in the past. So again, just avoid these at all costs. If you are not someone that supports them, let me know in the comments below your thoughts on everything we talked about in this video. But hopefully we see with these reports of the sales being low that developers decide to start putting their games fully on the cartridge. But that is it for this video. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this in the future. It helps me out, helps the video out, helps the channel out immensely. And check out the Discord, people over there hanging out, talking Switch 2 stuff all the time. But until next time, peace.